Welcome to Wildlife for Sleep, a place where ancient oceans breathe slowly, where shadows drift beneath the waves, and where stories are told, not to awaken the mind, but to gently quiet it if these facts help you relax or slowly drift into sleep. Please like the video, subscribe to Wildlife for Sleep, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support helps this channel continue creating peaceful, slow science-inspired sleep documentaries. Now settle into a comfortable position, let your breathing soften, and allow the surface world to fade away. Tonight, we descend into the deepest waters of the sea, before sailors named storms, before charts traced coastlines, before currents were measured in degrees and salinity. There was only observation and repetition, and the long patience of communities who lived beside water and learned its moods by watching the way mist gathered at dusk and how moonlight moved across tidal flats. And in the island world that would one day be called Japan, this watching became tradition, and tradition became story, and story became a vessel for environmental knowledge passed carefully from one generation to the next. Modern ocean science begins with data, temperature gradients, pressure fields, circulation models. But coastal cultures began with something simpler: attention. Fishermen memorized wave cadence. Villages tracked seasonal winds. Elders noticed when currents shifted just enough to alter fish migration. Over centuries, these observations accumulated into an intuitive understanding of the sea as a living system, responsive to subtle changes in atmosphere and geography. It is within this slow accumulation of coastal memory that Umibōzu first appears, not as monster, not as spectacle, but as presence. Japanese folklore does not introduce Umibōzu through battle or prophecy. It arrives quietly, emerging on calm nights when the water lies smooth and the sky offers little warning, a vast dark form rising without turbulence, as if lifted by pressure rather than force. This detail matters because in real marine dynamics, the most dangerous conditions often arrive without violence at first. Thermal inversions, rogue waves generated far from their point of impact, pressure anomalies traveling invisibly across basins. The sea does not always announce its changes. Sometimes it simply reorganizes. From a scientific perspective, coastal Japan sits at the convergence of powerful systems: warm currents moving northward from the tropics, cold waters descending from higher latitudes, deep tectonic trenches shaping bathymetry, and seasonal monsoons altering surface conditions. This intersection produces one of the most complex marine environments on Earth. Nutrients upwell. Storms intensify rapidly. Internal waves propagate beneath calm surfaces. To communities living along these shores, unpredictability was not abstract. It was daily reality. Fishing boats could depart under clear skies and encounter lethal conditions hours later. Smooth seas could conceal deep instability. Entire villages learned to read not just clouds and wind, but silence itself, the way quiet water sometimes preceded sudden change. Umibōzu embodies that silence. Its defining characteristic is not rage, it is stillness. Folklore describes it as appearing during tranquil passages, rising slowly, blocking starlight, asking impossible questions or demanding barrels of water, then vanishing as abruptly as it arrived. These behaviors mirror what modern disaster studies call threshold events, moments when systems cross invisible limits and transition rapidly from stable to unstable. In documentary terms, Umibōzu represents the ocean at its most deceptive, not storm-driven, not chaotic, but reorganizing beneath apparent calm. Japanese maritime tradition treated this with profound respect. Small boats were built low and flexible, designed to ride sudden swells. Lantern signals conveyed danger across distances. Certain words were avoided at sea. Silence itself became protocol. These practices were not superstition. They were adaptive behaviors shaped by generations of exposure to rapid marine transition. Anthropologists recognize this pattern worldwide. Cultures facing volatile environments encode survival knowledge into mythic form. Where Norse societies gave shape to circulation through Jörmungandr, Japanese coastal communities distilled oceanic uncertainty into Umibōzu, a boundary presence that appears when predictability dissolves. What makes Umibōzu distinct is scale. Unlike serpents or dragons that coil around worlds, Umibōzu manifests locally. It rises near boats. It confronts individuals. It does not encircle continents. It interrupts journeys. This reflects a different relationship to the sea, not planetary enclosure but episodic encounter. The Japanese maritime world was defined less by open ocean voyaging and more by coastal navigation, island hopping, and nearshore fishing. So Umibōzu becomes personal. It meets fishermen eye to eye. It stands between traveler and horizon. From a systems viewpoint, this represents localized instability rather than global circulation. Sudden pressure shifts, internal waves, or convergence zones capable of generating dangerous conditions in otherwise placid waters. Modern oceanographers now map such phenomena with satellites and sensors. Ancient sailors mapped them with story. And so the documentary begins here, not with violence, not with catastrophe, but with quiet water, with lantern light, with a boat moving slowly across reflective sea while unseen gradients rearrange beneath the surface. Because every oceanic transformation begins this way, with calm, with stillness, with a silence that feels too complete. In the next chapter, we will descend beneath that surface, into Japanese coastal geology, tectonic boundaries, and deep water circulation, examining how earthquakes, trenches, and hidden currents created the environmental conditions that gave rise to Umibōzu in the first place. To understand why Umibōzu belongs specifically to the waters surrounding Japan, we must move below the visible sea, because the surface tells only a fraction of the story. And beneath Japan's coastlines lies one of the most dynamically complex marine environments on Earth, shaped by tectonic collision, deep ocean circulation, and rapid atmospheric coupling, a convergence of forces that creates conditions where calm can coexist with instability, and where sudden transformation is not anomaly but expectation. Japan sits along the western margin of the Pacific Ocean, directly above multiple subduction zones where immense tectonic plates slide beneath one another, forming deep trenches, steep continental slopes, and fractured seabeds that channel energy upward from the planet's interior. And from a scientific perspective, this matters profoundly because bathymetry, the shape of the ocean floor, controls how currents move, how pressure waves propagate, and how internal tides form beneath seemingly placid surfaces. And it is precisely in such environments that localized oceanic disturbances can arise without warning. Modern oceanography shows that when strong currents pass over abrupt underwater topography, they generate internal waves, massive, slow-moving oscillations that travel through layers of different water density far below the surface. Invisible to the eye, yet capable of producing sudden surface surges when they intersect with shallow regions. And fishermen operating near island chains or trench edges can encounter abrupt changes in wave height, boat stability, and water behavior even on nights when wind remains absent and skies stay clear. And this phenomenon aligns uncannily with traditional descriptions of Umibōzu, appearing during calm passages, rising vertically from still water, disrupting vessels without the prelude of storm. These are not supernatural mechanics. They are physical ones. The waters around Japan are also shaped by intersecting currents, including warm subtropical flows moving northward and colder currents descending from higher latitudes. And where these meet, sharp thermal gradients develop, creating convergence zones rich in nutrients but prone to instability. And such gradients are fertile ground for rapid fog formation, sudden squalls, and pressure anomalies that can transform navigation conditions in minutes. Especially for small wooden boats operating close to shore. For centuries, Japanese coastal communities navigated these waters without satellites, radar, or real-time forecasts. They relied on pattern recognition. They memorized cloud textures. They watched how moonlight reflected off swell. They learned which inlets amplified surge and which reefs softened it. And when events exceeded familiar thresholds, when water rose without wind, when darkness thickened unnaturally, when boats began to behave unpredictably, those moments were preserved in narrative form, becoming encounters with Umibōzu. From a documentary standpoint, this is environmental memory encoded as folklore. Anthropologists studying maritime cultures consistently find that stories emerge most vividly around low-frequency, high-impact events, rare occurrences that are difficult to explain through daily experience, yet too important to forget. And in Japan's tectonically active seas, such events include sudden rogue waves, tsunami precursors, and pressure-driven surface disturbances, all of which can manifest during otherwise quiet conditions. The defining feature of Umibōzu, its sudden vertical emergence, mirrors how energy sometimes moves upward from deep layers rather than horizontally across the surface. And in modern fluid dynamics, this vertical coupling is well documented. Deep currents collide with submarine ridges. Energy reflects upward. Stratified layers destabilize, and localized columns of turbulence form, producing abrupt surface effects that feel as though something massive has risen from below. To sailors without instruments, such moments feel intentional, directed, personal, which is why Umibōzu is not depicted as distant or planetary but proximal and confronting. It meets boats directly. It blocks horizons. It occupies the immediate field of vision. This reflects the scale at which Japanese maritime life operated. Coastal routes, island passages, nearshore fisheries. The danger was not abstract circulation around continents. It was the sudden instability encountered within sight of land. Even vessel design evolved in response. Traditional Japanese fishing boats emphasized low profiles and flexible hulls, allowing them to ride unpredictable swell rather than resist it. Ballast practices varied by region, adapting to local wave regimes. Certain sounds were avoided at sea, not out of superstition, but because silence helped crews detect subtle changes in water movement. Within this adaptive framework, Umibōzu becomes a personification of deep water mechanics intruding into surface reality. It is the moment when hidden layers assert themselves, when stratification collapses, when equilibrium dissolves, and critically, Umibōzu does not linger. Like many physical ocean processes, it appears, disrupts, and withdraws, leaving survivors with memory rather than explanation. This transient nature is central to its mythic identity. It does not conquer territories. It interrupts journeys. It leaves behind shaken sailors and altered routes. Modern disaster science recognizes this pattern clearly. Short-lived, high-impact events often produce the strongest cultural imprint precisely because they defy routine preparedness. Earthquakes, flash floods, and rogue waves do not announce themselves through gradual escalation. They arrive across thresholds. Umibōzu lives in that threshold. We pause here because Chapter 2 brings us beneath appearances. Calm seas are revealed as layered systems. Quiet nights conceal moving gradients. The giant of folklore emerges not from imagination alone, but from the physics of stratified water, tectonic architecture, and intersecting currents. The ocean around Japan is not merely deep, it is vertically alive. And Umibōzu is how that verticality became visible. In the next chapter, we will turn toward human adaptation, examining how fishermen, monks, and coastal villages organized daily life around this unpredictable marine environment, and how ritual, boatcraft, and silence itself became tools for navigating a sea that could change character without warning. Living beside a sea that could transform without warning required more than courage. It required systems of behavior refined over generations. And along the coasts of Japan, maritime life gradually evolved into a culture of attentiveness, restraint, and adaptive ritual, where survival depended not on overpowering the ocean, but on learning when not to challenge it. And it is within this lived discipline that Umibōzu becomes fully intelligible, not as superstition, but as an organizing principle for conduct at sea. Ethnographic records from coastal regions show that fishing communities developed finely tuned norms governing speech, movement, and timing. Certain words were avoided while underway. Loud laughter was discouraged. Sudden gestures were minimized. These practices were not born from fear of angering spirits, but from pragmatic awareness. Sound carries differently over water, and quiet allows crews to detect subtle changes in hull vibration, wave cadence, and wind texture. Silence was a sensor. Modern maritime training reinforces this insight. Experienced sailors still speak of listening to the boat, feeling shifts in balance, hearing changes in water flow along the hull. The Japanese codified this sensory discipline into custom. Over time, moments when silence coincided with sudden disturbance were remembered and narrated as encounters with Umibōzu, reinforcing the lesson that calm does not equal safety. Boat design mirrored this philosophy. Coastal vessels favored shallow drafts and flexible frames that absorbed sudden motion rather than resisting it. Nets and lines were arranged for rapid release. Cargo was kept minimal during night passages. These features reflect an understanding of transient instability, designing not for constant force, but for sudden, unpredictable change. In engineering terms, this is resilience through flexibility. Religious practice, too, aligned with environmental awareness. Coastal temples and shrines were positioned to face open water, serving as visual anchors for sailors and as places of reflection before departure. Monks and priests emphasized humility toward natural forces, teaching that the sea's quiet moments deserved as much respect as its storms. Within this worldview, Umibōzu was not an enemy to be defeated, but a reminder of limits, an embodiment of moments when human intention must yield to environmental reality. Historical accounts describe sailors responding to Umibōzu not with attack, but with compliance or retreat, offering empty barrels when demanded, remaining silent, lowering sails. Symbolically, these actions align with modern risk mitigation. Reduce load, minimize exposure, avoid escalation. The myth encodes a simple rule: when the system behaves unpredictably, do less, not more. Anthropologists note that such narratives function as behavioral algorithms. They compress complex decision-making into memorable story. A fisherman does not need to understand internal waves or pressure gradients to know that calm nights can be dangerous. He needs only to remember the giant that rises from still water and punishes hubris. This is why Umibōzu is often described as faceless, smooth, and expressionless. It is not motivated by anger or desire. It acts without emotion. This aligns closely with how natural systems operate. The ocean does not punish. It responds. Outcomes follow conditions, not intent. By removing personality from the yakai, the myth subtly teaches that negotiation is futile. Only adaptation matters. Children raised in these communities learned early that silence at sea was strength. Elders passed down not just stories but habits. When to turn back, when to wait, when to trust routine, and when to abandon it. These lessons were reinforced during calm nights, precisely when complacency posed the greatest risk. Umibōzu appears not in chaos, but in deceptive tranquility. From a documentary standpoint, this chapter reveals how myth operates as an extension of environmental science. Observation becomes story. Story becomes behavior. Behavior enhances survival. The yakai is not evidence of ignorance, but of careful empirical learning transmitted without instruments or equations. We pause here because Chapter 3 centers the human response. Umibōzu is no longer just an oceanic phenomenon or geological expression. It becomes a teacher, one that enforces attention, humility, and restraint. Through silence, design, and ritual, coastal Japan adapted to a sea defined by hidden motion. In the next chapter, we will expand outward again, examining how Umibōzu fits within the wider ecosystem of Japanese yakai, why this particular figure emerges from the sea, and how it contrasts with other spirits shaped by forest, mountain, and river. To understand what makes Umibōzu so distinctive, it helps to place it within the broader ecology of Japanese yakai, not as a hierarchy of monsters, but as a distributed system of environmental representations, each emerging from a specific landscape, each encoding a different relationship between humans and the forces that surround them. Because in Japanese folklore, spirits do not arise arbitrarily. They arise where conditions demand explanation, restraint, and respect. In mountain regions, figures like Tengu emerge, beings of wind, height, and sudden violence, associated with storms, avalanches, and the dangerous unpredictability of steep terrain. In rivers and wetlands, Kappa appears, playful yet lethal, reflecting currents, undertows, and the deceptive calm of shallow water. Forests produce spirits tied to disorientation and shadow, while crossroads generate figures associated with transition and choice. Each yakai maps closely to a specific risk environment. Umibōzu belongs to the open sea, and the open sea, unlike forests or rivers, offers no concealment, no shelter, no immediate escape. This is why Umibōzu is portrayed without ornamentation, no claws, no scales, no expressive face. It is smooth, dark, cylindrical, rising like a column from the water. Its form mirrors the geometry of the ocean itself, depth without texture, mass without edge. Where other yakai reflect localized danger, Umibōzu reflects exposure. From a documentary perspective, this minimalism is meaningful. The greatest maritime threats are often the least visible: pressure changes, internal waves, sudden loss of buoyancy. The ocean does not need teeth to kill. It needs only imbalance. Umibōzu's blankness teaches that danger does not announce intent. Comparative folklore studies show that societies tend to anthropomorphize hazards just enough to make them memorable, but not so much that they feel negotiable. Kappa can be tricked. Tengu can be appeased or fought. Umibōzu cannot. Stories emphasize that reasoning with it fails. Aggression provokes disaster. Only compliance or withdrawal allows survival. This reflects a precise environmental truth. Some systems cannot be bargained with. Mountain storms may be outrun. River currents may be diverted. But open ocean instability, once encountered, offers few options beyond reduction of exposure. Sailors confronted by Umibōzu often survive by giving it empty barrels, objects that remove expectation, that signal surrender of cargo and intent. Symbolically, this mirrors real maritime emergency response. Jettison weight, reduce sail, lower profile, ride out disturbance. The myth encodes the correct response in narrative form. Another key distinction is timing. Many yakai appear at liminal hours: dusk, dawn, seasonal transitions. Umibōzu appears specifically at night, often under moonlight, when visual cues are weakest and depth perception fails. Modern accident analysis shows that night navigation dramatically increases risk, especially in coastal waters where unseen swells and reflections distort perception. Once again, folklore tracks reality. Unlike forest spirits that inhabit specific locations, Umibōzu is mobile. It appears, vanishes, and does not claim territory. This mobility reflects the nature of marine risk. Danger moves with currents, pressure fields, and wave trains. What is safe one night may be lethal the next. The yakai is not bound to place, it is bound to condition. From a cultural standpoint, this makes Umibōzu especially unsettling. There is no shrine to control it, no boundary to mark its domain, only behavior, only judgment, only restraint. In this way, Umibōzu occupies a unique role within the yakai system. It is not moralizing. It does not punish wrongdoing. It responds to circumstance. It appears when humans misread calm as permission. Its lesson is epistemic, not ethical. Do not assume stability from appearance alone. Anthropologists often note that Japanese folklore places less emphasis on good versus evil and more on harmony versus disruption. Umibōzu fits squarely within this framework. It emerges when harmony between human action and environmental condition collapses. It vanishes when balance is restored. We pause here because Chapter 4 clarifies Umibōzu's place in the mythic ecosystem. It is not one monster among many. It is the ocean's correction mechanism, a reminder that exposure without understanding invites consequence. In the next chapter, we will turn from mythology back towards science, examining specific real-world phenomena, rogue waves, internal tides, and pressure-driven surges that likely inspired Umibōzu encounters, and how modern instruments have finally made visible what folklore described centuries ago. For centuries, encounters with Umibōzu were recorded as inexplicable, events that violated intuition, arriving without storm or warning. Yet modern ocean science has gradually revealed a category of phenomena that behave in exactly this way, processes that convert hidden energy into sudden vertical motion, transforming tranquil surfaces into moments of acute danger. And it is within this convergence of folklore and fluid dynamics that Umibōzu becomes most clearly legible as documentary evidence rather than imagination. One of the most relevant phenomena is the rogue wave, once dismissed by scientists as maritime exaggeration, and now extensively documented through satellite altimetry, wave buoys, and offshore platforms. Rogue waves do not require storms at their point of impact. They can form when wave trains traveling at different speeds converge, when currents compress wave energy, or when underlying bathymetry focuses motion upward. The result is a single, steep wall of water rising abruptly from an otherwise ordinary sea, an event so sudden that sailors historically described it as something standing up from the surface. This language mirrors Umibōzu precisely. Descriptions emphasize verticality, mass, and sudden presence rather than horizontal approach. The yakai rises. It blocks vision. It overwhelms proximity. These are the perceptual hallmarks of rogue wave encounters, especially at night, when depth cues are minimal and scale is difficult to judge. Another key mechanism is the internal wave. Unlike surface waves driven by wind, internal waves propagate along density boundaries within the ocean, layers where temperature or salinity changes sharply with depth. These waves can reach amplitudes far larger than surface waves, yet remain invisible from above until they interact with shallow seabeds or coastlines, where they convert into powerful surges. Satellite imagery has captured these internal waves traveling hundreds of kilometers, their presence betrayed only by subtle changes in surface texture. For small fishing boats operating near island chains and continental slopes, precisely the environment surrounding Japan, internal waves can create sudden lifting forces, unexpected currents, and abrupt loss of stability without any atmospheric signal. To sailors without instruments, such an event feels intentional, as though something massive has pushed upward from below. This is Umibōzu's domain. Pressure anomalies also play a role. Rapid changes in atmospheric pressure, even without wind, can alter sea level locally through a phenomenon known as the inverted barometer effect. When pressure drops suddenly, the sea surface rises. In confined coastal areas or near steep underwater topography, this rise can be amplified, producing localized surges under otherwise calm skies. Combined with tides, these effects can push water where it does not usually go, onto decks, into boats, across familiar thresholds. Modern sensors detect these changes easily. Ancient sailors detected them with their bodies. A boat sits differently in water. The rhythm changes. The silence feels wrong. Folklore captures these embodied warnings through narrative. Umibōzu appears when the sea stops behaving like a surface and begins behaving like a column, when depth asserts itself upward. The yakai's smooth, cylindrical form echoes the physics of these events. No cresting wave, no foaming chaos, just mass rising where it should not. Documentary records from the late 20th century finally validated what maritime cultures had long insisted. Ships were lost in calm conditions. Offshore platforms recorded waves twice as high as expected. Buoys registered vertical accelerations inconsistent with wind-driven models. Science caught up with story. What is most striking is that Umibōzu folklore does not exaggerate these events. It simplifies them. It strips away unnecessary detail and preserves only what matters. Calm precedes danger. Silence precedes upheaval. Reduction of action increases survival. These are empirically sound rules for navigating rare but severe oceanic anomalies. From a modern risk analysis standpoint, Umibōzu functions as a heuristic, a mental shortcut for decision-making under uncertainty. When cues conflict with expectation, assume the system, not perception, is correct. Reduce exposure. Do not escalate. Prepare for vertical motion. This is precisely how contemporary maritime safety training now frames low-frequency, high-impact hazards. We pause here because Chapter 5 completes the bridge between myth and measurement. The calm sea giant no longer belongs to folklore alone. It occupies a real category of physical events that science struggled for decades to accept, let alone predict. Umibōzu is not the ocean's anger. It is the ocean's geometry. In the next chapter, we will turn toward memory and transmission, how these rare encounters were preserved accurately across generations without data or diagrams, and why storytelling proved to be the most reliable storage medium for knowledge about events that occur once in a lifetime. Events like those attributed to Umibōzu are, by their nature, rare. They do not occur often enough to be learned through repetition within a single lifetime. Yet when they do occur, their consequences are so severe that forgetting them is not an option. This creates a paradox familiar to modern risk science. How does a society preserve accurate knowledge of low-frequency, high-impact events without continuous data, instrumentation, or written records? In coastal Japan, The answer was memory, carefully shaped, socially reinforced, and transmitted through story. Anthropologists studying oral cultures have long observed that storytelling excels precisely where statistics fail. Numbers fade, stories persist. A rogue wave described as a wall of water may be forgotten, but a silent giant rising from calm seas is not. The image anchors attention. The narrative encodes conditions. The lesson survives. Japanese fishing communities developed highly structured methods for this transmission. Stories were not told casually. They were told at specific times, during winter evenings before long voyages, after funerals at sea. Elders controlled pacing and emphasis. Details remained consistent across generations. The calm night, the sudden rise, the wrong response, the narrow escape. Variation was minimal. Accuracy mattered more than embellishment. This is how environmental knowledge becomes durable. Modern cognitive science confirms that emotionally charged narratives are retained with greater fidelity than abstract instruction. Umibōzu stories evoke awe rather than terror, caution rather than panic. They imprint a mood, quiet vigilance, that shapes behavior long after details fade. A sailor may not recall every word of the tale, but he remembers the feeling associated with calm water at night. This emotional calibration is critical. Overreaction to rare events can be as dangerous as complacency. Umibōzu does not cause sailors to avoid the sea entirely. It teaches them when to withdraw, when to reduce load, when to remain silent. The story preserves proportional response. Ritual reinforces memory. Certain nights were avoided for travel. Specific gestures preceded departure. Lantern placement followed tradition. These practices were not superstitions in isolation. They were mnemonic devices, reminders that conditions matter more than intention. In this way, culture itself becomes a warning system. Even language reflects this preservation. Coastal dialects developed precise terms for subtle water states, surface textures, swell patterns, reflections under moonlight, that inland speakers never used. Such vocabulary functions like metadata attached to the Umibōzu narrative, enabling listeners to recognize precursor conditions in real time. From a documentary standpoint, this is distributed intelligence. No single person understands the entire system, but the system understands itself through shared memory. Knowledge is stored redundantly across people, practices, and places. When one generation is lost to disaster, the knowledge does not vanish with them. This resilience contrasts sharply with modern technological dependence. Instrumental records span decades at most. Oral traditions can span centuries. In Japan's seismically and oceanographically volatile environment, such durability mattered. Umibōzu persists not because people believed literally in a giant, but because the giant was a reliable container for truth. It preserved the unobservable. It remembered the invisible. It warned without calculation. We pause here because Chapter 6 reveals why Umibōzu survived modernization. Even as navigation improved and instruments proliferated, fishermen continued to respect the old stories, not because they rejected science, but because the stories captured something science still struggles with: the lived experience of uncertainty. In the next chapter, we will examine what happens when these ancient narratives collide with modern technology, how radar, engines, and confidence altered behavior at sea, and why Umibōzu did not disappear when science arrived, but changed form instead. When engines replaced oars and radar screens began to glow on night bridges, many assumed that figures like Umibōzu would vanish into the past, dissolved by instrumentation and predictive models. Yet what followed was not disappearance, but transformation, because technology changed how humans moved across the sea. But it did not change the sea itself, and in some cases, it altered human behavior in ways that made ancient lessons newly relevant. Modern navigation dramatically reduced certain risks. Engines allowed boats to outrun storms. Radios enabled distress calls. Radar revealed approaching vessels and weather systems beyond visual range. Satellite forecasts mapped typhoons days in advance. These advances saved countless lives, but they also introduced a subtle shift in perception. Confidence expanded faster than understanding. Risk scientists call this the automation paradox. As systems become more reliable, users become less vigilant. Attention narrows. Trust migrates from environment to interface. When conditions fall outside modeled expectations, response time increases because intuition has been outsourced to screens. This is precisely where Umibōzu returns, not as belief, as blind spot. Rogue waves continue to strike modern cargo ships in calm conditions. Offshore platforms recorded sudden vertical accelerations without storm context. Fishing vessels capsized at night under clear skies. Investigations often concluded with the same phrase: unexpected sea state. The events were real. The models had simply not anticipated them. From a documentary perspective, this is a familiar pattern. Technology excels at frequent, measurable phenomena. It struggles with rare, emergent behavior produced by complex coupling, exactly the category Umibōzu represents. Internal waves, pressure-driven surges, and bathymetric focusing still evade precise short-term prediction, even with satellites and supercomputers. Japanese maritime culture responded not by abandoning technology, but by reintegrating tradition. Veteran captains continued to feel the sea even while reading screens. Silence on deck remained common practice at night. Some fishing cooperatives preserved rules about departure times and load limits that had no basis in regulation but deep roots in experience. In interviews conducted by maritime anthropologists, older sailors often expressed distrust not of science, but of overconfidence. "The sea doesn't know your radar," one fisherman remarked. This sentiment echoes the core lesson of Umibōzu. Systems do not respond to intention or equipment. They respond to condition. Interestingly, modern storytelling did not eliminate Umibōzu, it reframed it. The yakai began to appear in contemporary literature and film not as a literal giant, but as an unseen presence, a metaphor for systemic failure, for the moment when instruments go silent or data contradicts reality. The calm night became a symbol not of safety, but of uncertainty. In this way, Umibōzu adapted. It moved from folklore to cautionary principle, from monster to reminder, from sea spirit to systems warning. Modern documentary science now acknowledges what traditional knowledge long preserved, that some of the most dangerous states are transitional and poorly signaled. A smooth sea can conceal extreme vertical motion. Stable indicators can mask underlying instability. Confidence itself can become risk factor. The ancient narrative survives because it describes a condition, not a creature, and conditions persist. We pause here because Chapter 7 marks the convergence of past and present. Umibōzu does not oppose technology, it complements it, filling the gaps where models thin and probability fails. The yakai becomes a bridge between empirical observation and lived experience, reminding modern sailors of an older discipline, attention without assumption. In the next chapter, we will widen the lens once more, comparing Umibōzu to similar calm sea entities across the world, examining why different maritime cultures independently imagine giants that rise from still water, and what this reveals about the shared psychology of ocean risk. When Japanese fishermen spoke of Umibōzu, they were not alone in describing danger that emerges from stillness, because across maritime cultures, separated by oceans, languages, and centuries, remarkably similar figures appear wherever humans learn that calm water can be deceptive. And for documentary science, this convergence is not coincidence but pattern, a shared response to the same class of environmental risk. In the North Atlantic, sailors told of immense presences rising from placid seas, most famously the kraken, a being said to surface without storm, creating whirlpools and sudden lifting forces that overwhelmed ships. While later art exaggerated its tentacles and rage, early accounts emphasized scale, quiet emergence, and localized disruption, traits that mirror Umibōzu far more closely than later popular depictions suggest. In Polynesian navigation traditions, ocean spirits appear in tranquil lagoons and channels, warning of invisible currents and sudden depth changes. Along the coasts of West Africa and the Caribbean, fishermen speak of calm nights when the sea stands up, lifting boats without wind. Anthropologists studying these narratives note a consistent structure. Calm conditions, right arrow sudden vertical motion, right arrow survival through restraint. This triad maps directly onto a specific category of oceanic phenomena, events driven by convergence, internal waves, or bathymetric focusing, rather than wind. Cultures that spent generations on water independently encoded the same lesson because they encountered the same physics. What differs is scale. Where Norse societies imagined continental circulation and boundary monsters, Japanese culture, rooted in coastal passage and island navigation, imagined a proximal giant that confronts individual boats. Polynesian traditions emphasize guidance and avoidance, reflecting long-distance voyaging through known current corridors. Each myth calibrates to lived exposure. From a scientific perspective, this suggests that myth acts like a low-resolution global dataset. Many independent observations of rare events aggregated into symbolic form, where one culture records an anomaly as a giant, another records it as a god, and a third as a taboo. Strip away the symbolism, and the underlying data align. Modern oceanography has begun to formalize these connections. Satellite imagery reveals internal wave trains spanning hundreds of kilometers in regions long associated with calm sea legends. Pressure sensors detect sudden sea level rises during clear conditions in areas rich with folklore. The geography matches the stories. Crucially, these myths do not teach fear of the ocean. They teach respect for uncertainty. None of these giants are defeated through force. Survival comes from reducing exposure, altering course, or waiting. This is exactly how mariners today manage rare hazards that cannot be reliably predicted. The global recurrence of calm sea giants underscores a key documentary insight. When multiple cultures independently warn of the same condition, the condition deserves attention, especially if it contradicts intuitive assumptions like calm equals safe. We pause here because Chapter 8 widens the lens. Umibōzu is revealed not as an isolated curiosity, but as one node in a worldwide network of maritime memory. Different names, same lesson. The sea's most dangerous moments are not always loud. In the next chapter, we will return to Japan to examine how these insights shaped ethics and decision-making, how humility, patience, and withdrawal became virtues at sea, and how Umibōzu quietly influenced a moral code built around restraint. Among the quiet lessons carried by Umibōzu, none is more enduring than this. There are moments when the most skillful action is not advance, but retreat, because in environments governed by hidden gradients and delayed feedback, insistence can amplify danger while restraint preserves life. And along the coasts of Japan, this understanding matured into an ethic that shaped decisions at sea long before it found words in philosophy. Modern risk science formalizes this as the precautionary principle. When uncertainty is high and consequences severe, reduce exposure. But Japanese maritime culture arrived at the same conclusion through lived experience. Fishermen learned that turning back on a calm night was not cowardice. It was judgment. Elders praised crews who returned empty-handed after sensing wrongness in the water. Stories elevated survival over haul. Reputation accrued to those who read conditions, not those who pressed luck. Umibōzu encodes this ethic with unusual clarity. In the tales, survival follows compliance or withdrawal. Silence kept, sails lowered, weight reduced, course altered. Aggression fails. Argument fails. The sea is not persuaded, it is respected. This is an ethic oriented toward systems rather than outcomes, optimized for continuity, not conquest. Anthropologists note that such ethics emerge most strongly in environments where hazards are rare but catastrophic. Over time, communities learn that success measured narrowly, one more catch, one more mile, can undermine success measured broadly, returning to fish another season. The ethic of withdrawal protects the future by sacrificing the present. This orientation is reinforced by language. Coastal dialects contain verbs that distinguish between going and testing, between continuing and pressing. These nuances guide decision-making under uncertainty. To press is to risk the serpent's attention. To wait is to let gradients pass. Religious practice aligns with this restraint. Sea-facing shrines emphasize gratitude rather than dominion. Offerings acknowledge limits. Silence at night is framed as attentiveness, not fear. Even today, veteran captains speak of nights when they listen first, delaying departure until the water's rhythm feels coherent again. From a documentary perspective, this ethic anticipates contemporary safety culture. Aviation, nuclear power, and medicine now emphasize stop rules, checklists, and deference to uncertainty. Procedures that empower individuals to halt operations without penalty when conditions diverge from expectation. Umibōzu provided a cultural stop rule centuries earlier. The ethic also shapes leadership. Captains are expected to turn back without justification beyond judgment. Crews are trained to accept that call. Blame is reserved not for caution, but for ignoring signs. This social reinforcement is critical. Without it, precaution erodes under pressure to perform. We pause here because Chapter 9 shows how a sea spirit becomes a moral compass. Umibōzu teaches that wisdom at the boundary lies in knowing when to yield. In a world of layered systems and hidden motion, humility is not weakness, it is skill. In the next chapter, we will explore how this ethic surfaces during crisis. What happens when withdrawal is no longer possible? How crews improvise under sudden vertical motion, and how the stories preserve not just warnings, but techniques for survival when thresholds are crossed. There are moments when judgment arrives too late, when a boat is already committed, when distance to shore is too great, and when the sea's quiet rearrangement crosses a threshold beneath the keel. And in Japanese maritime tradition, this is the narrow space where Umibōzu ceases to be a warning and becomes a test, not of bravery, but of technique. because survival in these accounts does not come from confrontation or speed, but from reducing amplification at the exact moment instability peaks. Modern marine safety studies describe this scenario with precise language: loss of predictability, sudden vertical acceleration, nonlinear response. For the crews who experienced it centuries ago, the language was simpler. The sea stood up, yet the prescribed responses were remarkably aligned with contemporary best practice. Weight was reduced immediately. Nets were cut free without hesitation. Sails were lowered or slackened to avoid catching lift at the wrong angle. Oars were stilled to prevent resonance with the hull. Voices dropped to near silence so that motion could be felt rather than argued over. These details recur across Umibōzu stories with unusual consistency, suggesting that the narratives preserved actionable procedure rather than metaphor alone. In modern terms, they describe damping, removing sources of oscillation, lowering the system's energy intake, and allowing the vessel to ride the disturbance instead of fighting it. Engineers recognize this logic in suspension systems and shock absorbers. Sailors learned it by survival. Crucially, the tales emphasize timing. Acting too early, overreacting to mere calm wastes opportunity. Acting too late, pressing on despite subtle cues, magnifies risk. The window between is narrow. Umibōzu appears in that window, not to judge intent, but to mark the instant when conditions flip from navigable to volatile. The Yakai's arrival signals that amplification has begun. Survivors often describe a change in feel before any visible wave. The hull's rhythm shortens, buoyancy shifts, lantern reflections distort. This matches instrumented observations of internal waves and focused swell, where vertical motion precedes surface braking. The stories instruct crews to trust embodied signals over expectation, to believe the boat before the eye. When escape is impossible, compliance becomes strategy. Offering empty barrels, so prominent in the folklore, reads under documentary light as load shedding and acknowledgement of limits. An empty container reduces mass without adding drag. It also symbolically commits the crew to reduction rather than extraction. The lesson is not mystical, it is mechanical. What the stories do not include is equally telling. There is no successful ramming, no shouted command that restores order, no clever trick that defeats the sea. The absence teaches restraint. In complex systems at threshold, leverage is low and unintended consequences are high. Doing less is often doing right. We pause here, because Chapter 10 distills Umibōzu to its operational core. The calm sea giant is not a monster to be beaten. It is a boundary condition to be managed. When withdrawal fails, survival depends on recognizing amplification, reducing inputs, and allowing the system to pass through its unstable phase. In the next chapter, we will step back from the deck and look ashore. How communities received those who returned, how near misses were recorded without blame, and how collective learning continued even when loss could not be undone. When boats returned from nights shaped by uncertainty, whether intact, damaged, or fewer than before, the work of survival continues on land. And in Japanese coastal culture, this continuation is not marked by interrogation or blame, but by reception, by a deliberate social process that absorbs experience into memory so that it can guide the future. And it is here, on the quiet shore, that encounters with Umibōzu are transformed from private ordeal into collective knowledge. Ethnographic accounts describe a consistent pattern. Boats are met without fanfare. Gear is unloaded quietly. The first questions are practical. Are you hurt? Do you need water? Not accusatory. Only later, often after warmth and food are shared, does the story surface. This sequencing matters. Modern safety science shows that learning accelerates when psychological safety precedes analysis. Japanese maritime communities practiced this long before the term existed. Near misses are valued. Survivors are asked to speak, not to justify decisions, but to describe sensations. How the hull felt, how the lantern light changed, how silence sounded when the sea shifted. These sensory details are prized because they travel better than conclusions. They allow listeners to recognize the condition when it arrives for them. The story is corrected gently if it drifts, not to enforce orthodoxy, but to preserve fidelity. Accuracy saves lives. Loss, when it occurs, is handled with ritual that integrates grief into continuity. Memorial stones face the water. Names are spoken without embellishment. The sea is acknowledged without accusation. This posture prevents the corrosive search for fault that can fracture communities under stress. Instead, responsibility is distributed across condition, timing, and chance. The lesson is clear. The sea does not single out individuals. It responds to states. From a documentary standpoint, this is organizational learning at scale. Knowledge does not remain siloed with the captain. It diffuses across the harbor. Younger sailors hear the same story multiple times from different mouths at different ages, each retelling calibrating judgment a little finer. The narrative becomes infrastructure, an informal but robust safety system. Language again plays a role. Phrases that denote humility. The sea closed its hand, the water stood, frame events as systemic rather than personal. This framing preserves agency without assigning guilt. It allows improvement without shame. Modern accident investigation strives for the same balance and often struggles to achieve it. The shore, then, is not merely a boundary between land and water. It is a learning interface. What happens offshore is processed, distilled, and reintegrated into practice. Over generations, this interface becomes extraordinarily efficient. It remembers rare events with precision and forgets bravado quickly. Umibōzu persists in this setting not as a threat, but as a shared reference point. Saying its name is shorthand for a condition everyone understands. Calm that isn't safe, silence that carries motion. The word itself functions like a warning label. compact and durable. We pause here because Chapter 11 reveals how societies metabolize risk. Survival is not only about what happens at sea, it is about how the shore listens, records, and responds. Through reception rather than reproach, coastal Japan turned isolated encounters into communal foresight. In the next chapter, we will look forward in time, how these practices intersect with modern emergency response, insurance, and regulation, and how the old stories quietly shape contemporary decisions even when they are no longer named. As maritime life modernized, the knowledge once carried solely by story did not disappear. It migrated into institutions, procedures, and technology. And in contemporary Japan, the lessons encoded by Umibōzu can be traced, quietly but unmistakably, through the architecture of modern safety culture. Because when societies professionalize risk management, they often formalize what folklore learned first. Today, weather services issue advisories for sudden sea state change. Coastal authorities post night navigation cautions, and training manuals warn that calm conditions do not guarantee stability. Phrases that sound clinical but echo an older truth. These systems rely on buoys, satellites, and numerical models, yet they also incorporate human judgment, the authority to delay departure, to abort missions, to stand down when indicators diverge. This discretionary space is crucial. It is where Umibōzu still lives. From a systems perspective, modern maritime safety is layered. Sensors detect patterns, forecasts estimate probability, protocols guide action, and humans make final calls. Failures tend to occur at interfaces, when data is ambiguous, when incentives push continuation, when silence is misread as safety. It is precisely at these interfaces that traditional caution proves durable. Training emphasizes recognition of non-conforming cues, unusual reflections, atypical swell period, unexplained vessel motion. These cues are the modern equivalents of the old story's sensations. The language has changed, but the content remains. Instructors still say, in effect, trust the boat. This advice bridges centuries. Insurance and regulation reinforce the same ethic. Policies reward conservative decision-making. Investigations prioritize learning over blame. Near-miss reporting is encouraged. These practices mirror the shoreline reception described earlier. Absorb experience, preserve detail, distribute knowledge. What folklore once carried through narrative, institutions now carry through process. Yet technology introduces new challenges. Automation compresses attention. Continuous connectivity can mask uncertainty with confidence. The risk is not ignorance, but over-assurance. Here, the old warning becomes newly relevant. When systems look quiet, ask why. When indicators agree too easily, verify with senses. When calm persists at night, consider the vertical. In contemporary culture, Umibōzu appears less as a named figure and more as a motif, a calm frame that suddenly breaks. Documentaries, novels, and films use the image to explore systemic fragility, infrastructures that fail silently, markets that tip without alarm, oceans that change state beneath a smooth surface. The yakai's power adapts to the era by shifting domains, but its lesson remains intact. From a documentary standpoint, this chapter reveals continuity rather than replacement. Science did not disprove Umibōzu, it translated it. Folklore did not resist modernization, it seeded it. The same caution, encoded once in silence and barrels, now lives in stop rules and advisories. We pause here because Chapter 12 shows how ancient knowledge survives by changing form. The calm sea giant no longer rises to block lantern light, yet its presence is felt whenever a crew delays departure, whenever a system flags uncertainty, whenever a quiet night triggers restraint. In the next chapter, we will return to the sea itself, examining how climate change is altering the frequency and intensity of the very phenomena Umibōzu represents, and why calm water risk may increase rather than diminish in the years ahead. As the climate warms, the ocean does not simply grow more violent. It grows more layered, more stratified, more capable of hiding energy beneath appearances. And in this emerging seascape, the conditions associated with Umibōzu become not rarer, but more plausible, because warming alters the vertical structure of the sea in ways that favor sudden transition rather than gradual warning. Modern oceanography shows that rising surface temperatures strengthen stratification. Warm, lighter water sits atop cooler, denser layers, reducing vertical mixing. On the surface, this can look like calm. Below, it stores tension. Internal waves grow larger. Energy travels farther without expression. When that energy finally meets the right slope, tide, or current, it can release upward, abruptly. Marine heat waves, now documented with increasing frequency around Japan, intensify this effect. They stabilize the surface while amplifying gradients beneath. Satellites record smooth night seas coinciding with anomalous subsurface motion. Buoys detect sudden changes in vertical acceleration without corresponding wind. These are the fingerprints of a system primed for vertical surprise. From a documentary standpoint, this matters because it reframes risk. The old assumption, storms equal danger, calm equals safety, was always incomplete. Climate change widens that gap. It increases the number of nights when the sea looks benign while behaving otherwise. It expands the window in which Umibōzu's lesson applies. There is also a human dimension. As fisheries shift and seasons blur, crews are pressured to work marginal conditions. Longer trips, tighter margins, and unfamiliar timing increase exposure to low-frequency hazards. In risk analysis, this is a classic recipe. Altered baselines plus incentive pressure equals vulnerability. The response, again, is not fear, but calibration. Modern training emphasizes recognizing stratified risk, long swell periods, unexplained lift, glassy surfaces over known slopes. These cues echo the old stories almost word for word. The sea that is too quiet deserves scrutiny. We pause here because chapter 13 brings Umibōzu into the present tense. The calm sea giant is not a relic of a wilder past. It is a warning suited to a warming ocean, where smooth surfaces can conceal larger gradients than before. In the next chapter, we will look ahead, how education, design, and policy can carry this lesson forward, ensuring that the wisdom encoded in folklore continues to protect lives in an era of rapid change. When risk hides beneath calm, protection must be built not only into forecasts, but into craft, training, and decision culture. And in contemporary Japan, the legacy of Umibōzu quietly informs all three, because the most effective safety systems are those that assume the unexpected and reduce amplification when it arrives. Boat design offers a clear example. Small coastal vessels increasingly favor hulls that flex rather than resist, materials and frames that dissipate sudden vertical acceleration, instead of transmitting it directly to crew and cargo. Low centers of gravity, rapid load release, and simplified rigging are not just conveniences. They are design acknowledgments that vertical motion can arrive without warning. This philosophy echoes the old instruction to cut nets and shed weight. Build the option to do less into the object itself. Training follows the same logic. Night navigation modules emphasize state recognition over rule following. How to detect when the sea's behavior no longer matches its appearance. Crews practice aborting runs for reasons that cannot be neatly quantified. An unexplained change in feel, a mismatch between swell period and wind, a surface that looks too smooth over known slopes. These exercises legitimize judgment under uncertainty, preserving the authority to withdraw without penalty. Observation infrastructure completes the loop. Buoys, coastal radars, and subsurface sensors now monitor internal waves, pressure anomalies, and stratification in near real time. But crucially, these systems are paired with human interpretation. Alerts are phrased cautiously. Advisories stress uncertainty. The goal is not to replace intuition, but to support it. Technology as companion rather than commander. From a documentary perspective, this is how ancient knowledge survives modernization. It migrates into constraints, defaults, and permissions. It becomes easier to stop than to continue, easier to lighten than to load, easier to listen than to argue with the sea. We pause here because chapter 14 shows prevention in practice. The calm sea giant no longer needs to be named to be heeded. Its lesson is embedded in materials, curricula, and thresholds that favor restraint when appearances mislead. In the next chapter, we will return to the human interior, how attention, humility, and patience are cultivated, and why the most important instrument at sea remains the trained nervous system. Even with the best hulls, sensors, and advisories, the most sensitive instrument at sea remains the human nervous system, trained, calibrated, and respected. And in Japanese maritime culture, the quiet lessons associated with Umibōzu have always pointed inward, toward attention itself. Because when risk hides beneath calm, survival depends on perception before calculation, on noticing what does not fit before deciding what to do next. Modern neuroscience confirms what sailors learned empirically. Humans detect change fastest through multisensory integration. Tiny shifts in balance, vibration, sound, and light combine to form a signal long before any single cue crosses a threshold. On a night watch, the body often knows first. A hull's cadence tightens. The water's hiss along planks shortens. Lantern reflections lose symmetry. None of these is decisive alone. Together, they whisper transition. Japanese seamanship cultivated this capacity deliberately. Watch routines emphasized stillness, standing rather than pacing, listening rather than talking, so that baseline sensations were clear. Silence was not superstition. It was signal to noise control. The fewer competing inputs, the easier it was to register deviation. Umibōzu's quiet presence is the mythic echo of this practice. Danger announces itself softly, and only those who are quiet enough will hear. Training exercises today mirror this logic. Crews practice night transits with reduced instrumentation, learning to recognize non-visual cues. They rehearse aborts triggered by mismatch, when instruments say one thing and the body says another. Importantly, instructors validate these calls. Judgment is praised when it is early and conservative. This social reinforcement preserves sensitivity. Without it, people learn to ignore their own perception. From a documentary standpoint, this chapter underscores a subtle truth about complex systems. The most advanced detectors are often biological. Technology extends range and precision, but perception integrates context. Where models simplify, bodies synthesize. Umibōzu endures because it names the moment when synthesis matters most, when appearances are smooth but gradients are steep. Mindset matters as much as method. Humility keeps attention open. Patience prevents escalation. Curiosity asks, why does this feel different? Rather than insisting it must be fine. These traits are trainable. They are cultivated through mentorship, story, and permission to stop. They are also fragile. Incentives that reward continuation at all costs will erode them quickly. We pause here because Chapter 15 centers the human interior. The calm sea giant is not out there alone. It is also within, an invitation to listen, to slow down, to let perception lead when prediction thins. In the next chapter, we will widen the frame once more, looking at how these inner skills scale up, how organizations, fleets, and communities design cultures that keep attention alive in the long calm, so that rare transitions are met with readiness rather than super attention. When it belongs to one person, is fragile. When it belongs to a community, it becomes resilient. and in Japan's maritime regions, the quiet wisdom associated with Umibōzu scales outward from individual watchfulness into shared practice, shaping how fleets coordinate, how cooperatives decide, and how entire harbors learn to pause together when the sea's behavior drifts from expectation. Modern safety research shows that many disasters occur not because warnings were absent, but because they were isolated. One person noticed, another dismissed. Signals failed to synchronize. Coastal Japan evolved social mechanisms to prevent this fragmentation. Fishing cooperatives meet before departures. Conditions are discussed aloud. Doubt is normalized. When one captain hesitates, others listen. The cost of delay is shared. The benefit of survival is collective. This structure mirrors what high-reliability organizations do in aviation and medicine. Flatten authority during uncertainty, amplify weak signals, and treat hesitation as data. The old stories provide the emotional permission. If the sea can rise from stillness, then caution needs no heroics. Umibōzu becomes a common reference for a shared threshold. This feels like one of those nights. Harbors reinforce this culture physically. Notice boards carry advisories that emphasize uncertainty rather than certainty. Early warning centers share probabilistic language. Lights and signals are standardized so that a decision to stand down is visible and contagious. When a few boats remain tied, others follow. The calm night becomes a reason to wait, not to rush. Documentary interviews with fleet managers reveal a consistent theme. The most valuable safety feature is time. Time to listen. Time to compare notes. Time to let gradients pass. Communities that protect time by resisting pressure, by coordinating departures, by rewarding restraint, experience fewer losses from rare events. This is Umibōzu's ethic translated into governance. There is also a memory layer. After anomalous nights, briefings are held. Sensory details are captured while fresh. These notes circulate. Young crews hear them early in their careers, long before they face the condition themselves. Knowledge spreads laterally, not just vertically. The shore remains a learning interface. We pause here because Chapter 16 shows how vigilance survives at scale. The calm sea giant does not demand lone bravery. It rewards shared patience. When attention is distributed, rare transitions are met with readiness instead of surprise. In the next chapter, we will look beyond the harbor, how these lessons travel into education, media, and public understanding, shaping how a nation that lives with water talks about risk without fear. When a society lives alongside water, it must decide how to speak about risk, how to warn without paralyzing, how to educate without exaggeration. And in Japan, the long memory associated with Umibōzu offers a model for doing exactly that. Because the calm sea giant was never used to frighten people away from the ocean, but to teach a particular kind of attention that could coexist with work, travel, and daily life. Education along the coast reflects this balance. In school, Children learn about tides, currents, and seasonal winds alongside local stories. The narrative is not presented as literal danger, but as cultural shorthand, a way to remember that appearance and behavior can diverge. Lessons emphasize observation, how reflections change before swell, how fog forms over stratified water, how silence can mean stability or transition depending on context. Fear is absent. Curiosity is central. Public media follows the same approach. Documentaries, museum exhibits, and harbor signage avoid alarmist language. Instead, they highlight pattern recognition and decision points. A calm night is not framed as unsafe. It is framed as a condition that deserves listening. This nuance matters. Overwarning dulls attention. Underwarning invites surprise. The middle path preserves readiness. From a communication science perspective, Umibōzu functions as a low arousal signal. It carries seriousness without panic, gravity without spectacle. This makes it ideal for public understanding in a country that must communicate about tsunamis, typhoons, and coastal change without exhausting trust. The lesson is subtle. Risk is situational. Safety is dynamic. Judgment is learned. Museums and local archives reinforce continuity. Displays pair traditional art with modern instrumentation. Scrolls beside buoy data. Lanterns beside radar screens, inviting visitors to see story and science as complementary lenses. The past is not corrected by the present, it is contextualized. This integration helps new generations inherit caution without superstition. We pause here because Chapter 17 shows how knowledge is taught to endure. The calm sea giant becomes pedagogy, a way to speak about uncertainty that keeps people engaged rather than afraid. In the next chapter, we will look outward again, how these lessons resonate beyond Japan, informing global conversations about rare risks, climate adaptation, and the quiet hazards that accompany a warming, stratified ocean. As oceans warm and navigation intensifies, the lesson encoded by Umibōzu travels far beyond Japan's shores, because the condition it names, danger emerging from stillness, is not local but planetary, and in a world stitched together by shipping lanes, fisheries, and data cables, the calm sea problem becomes a shared challenge that requires shared language. Across disciplines, scientists now speak of compound and cascading risk, events that arise not from one driver but from interactions, stratification meeting bathymetry, pressure meeting tide, heat meeting current. These interactions often peak at night under clear skies, when visual cues are weakest and confidence is highest. Satellite products reveal internal wave bands marching beneath glassy surfaces. Buoys record vertical accelerations without wind. Accident reports repeat a familiar phrase: conditions were calm. International maritime training has begun to reflect this reality. Curricula emphasize anomaly detection over checklist compliance. Crews are taught to look for mismatches between expectation and sensation. Ports coordinate advisories that privilege uncertainty and discretion. The aim is not to predict every rare event, an impossible task, but to keep attention alive during the long quiet. From a documentary standpoint, folklore offers a surprisingly effective bridge. When educators explain internal waves or pressure-driven surges, they often reach for narrative analogies. A giant rising from below, the sea standing up. Because these images convey verticality, suddenness, and scale faster than equations. The metaphor does not replace science. It primes understanding. There is also an ethical dimension. As climate change increases stratification and lengthens calm intervals, economic pressure pushes crews to operate closer to thresholds. The global quiet becomes a productivity window and a risk window. Here, Umibōzu's ethic of withdrawal matters. Build systems that reward stopping early, that share the cost of delay, that protect the authority to say not tonight. International forums now discuss listening time, periods built into schedules for observation and comparison before night transits. Designers explore hulls and loads that damp vertical motion. Forecasters experiment with products that flag calm with risk rather than storm alone. These are modern translations of an old warning. We pause here because Chapter 18 shows how a local story becomes global guidance. The calm sea giant is not a myth to export. It is a condition to recognize, a posture to adopt, a reminder that the ocean's most consequential moves are sometimes the least announced. In the final chapter, we will return to where we began, quiet water under moonlight, and ask what endures when stories, instruments, and institutions align. Not fear of the sea, but a practiced respect for its silences. Return now to the scene that opens so many encounters. A boat moving gently across a polished surface, lantern light steady, wind absent, stars reflected so cleanly that sky and sea seem to trade places. And within this near-perfect calm, the lesson of Umibōzu becomes clearest. Because stillness, in both myth and science, is not the absence of motion. It is motion reorganized, energy redistributed into layers that do not announce themselves all at once. Modern fluid dynamics describes this as potential energy stored in stratification. Traditional seamanship describes it as a feeling. The water looks right, but it does not sound right. The difference is subtle. It requires patience to notice. And patience is precisely what this chapter is about. Across cultures, still water has been treated as a mirror, something that reflects, deceives, and invites misreading. Japanese maritime tradition adds a correction. Stillness deserves more attention, not less. Calm nights become checkpoints rather than green lights. The boat slows, the crew listens, decisions stretch in time. This stretching is protective. It allows weak signals to accumulate until they cross the threshold of recognition. From a documentary standpoint, this is an argument for tempo. Complex systems rarely reward speed at their margins. They reward timing. Umibōzu does not appear to punish haste. It appears when haste meets misinterpretation. The calm sea becomes dangerous only when it is treated as permission instead of condition. There is a broader resonance here beyond the ocean. In many domains, finance, infrastructure, climate, periods of stability often precede abrupt change. Indicators align too neatly. Variability shrinks, confidence rises. Then a hidden gradient releases. The same discipline applies. Slow down when things look easiest. Listen hardest when noise fades. Japanese folklore offers a language for this discipline without moralizing it. The giant does not accuse. It does not chase. It simply rises when the system's state changes. Responsibility lies not in defeating the giant, but in recognizing the state early enough to withdraw, reduce, or wait. This chapter, then, is not about the sea alone. It is about how humans relate to quiet, whether we fill it with action or use it to refine perception, whether we treat smoothness as safety or as a question. Umibōzu stands calm, smooth, expressionless, as the question made visible. We pause here because Chapter 19 brings us back to still water with new eyes. The lesson has traveled from geology to psychology, from folklore to forecasting, from boats to communities. What remains is not fear of the ocean, but a practiced respect for its silences. In the final chapter, we will close the circle, reflecting on what endures when story and science converge, and why the calm sea giant remains relevant not as a belief, but as a way of seeing. At the end of this long observation, when stories have been traced back to currents and currents back to stories, what remains is not a monster rising from the water, but a way of seeing the water itself. Because Umibōzu endures not as a belief to be defended or dismissed, but as a cognitive tool, an inherited lens through which humans learn to read calm without confusing it for safety, and silence without mistaking it for absence. In scientific terms, the ocean is a system that stores energy vertically as often as it releases it horizontally. Stratification, internal waves, pressure anomalies, and bathymetric focusing all operate beneath appearances, rearranging force quietly until conditions align for sudden expression. Instruments now confirm this. Models describe it. Satellites visualize it. Yet even with these tools, the most reliable early warning remains attention, trained, patient, and willing to pause when certainty thins. Japanese folklore arrived at this conclusion centuries earlier. Umibōzu does not rage. It does not chase. It does not roar. It rises, smooth, dark, unadorned. Its power lies in timing, not violence, in appearing precisely when human confidence is most likely to outrun understanding. In this way, it functions less like a creature and more like a boundary marker, signaling that the system has entered a state where ordinary rules no longer apply. What makes this remarkable is not the image itself, but its durability. Across centuries of technological change, from oars to engines, from lanterns to radar, the lesson remains intact. Calm nights still demand listening. Quiet seas still deserve hesitation. Withdrawal is still skill. These principles scale from individual boats to fleets, from harbors to nations, from oceans to other complex systems where stability can conceal transition. In documentary hindsight, Umibōzu stands as evidence that myth can be empirical, not because it predicts events, but because it preserves relationships. It preserves the relationship between appearance and behavior, between confidence and consequence, between silence and change. It reminds us that some truths are best carried not as numbers, but as images that slow us down just enough to notice what matters. As dawn breaks over a quiet harbor, boats return or remain tied. Decisions made in the night ripple outward into safety, into memory, into the next telling of the story. The sea looks unchanged, but those who watched closely know that looking is not enough. The sea must be listened to, felt, respected in its silences. That is what remains, not fear of the ocean, not belief in giants, but a practiced humility toward systems that move beneath surfaces, a willingness to pause when everything looks easy, a memory rising gently whenever the water is too calm.